Let's talk about the culling. The Culling is a game that was unleashed upon this world somewhere in the ancient era of, like the beginning of 2016. Although it was still in early access, it was met with pretty warm reception, seeing as it was one of the first games to adopt the soon-to-be-popular Battle Royale style of gameplay. One would think that being at the beginning of the game mode that turned into an absolute juggernaut in the gaming industry would still be relevant to this day. But that isn't the case with the Culling, at least not in the same capacity as other BR titans. I'm gonna level with you here, I actually really loved the Culling when it dropped. I was watching a few streamers playing it at the time, and it looked like an absolute blast, so I picked it up. The premise is the same as most Battle Royale games, but with a few twists which I enjoyed immensely. The biggest of these differences was the inclusion of perks. Every player could choose 3 of these perks and create their own warrior to do battle with. You could choose to have more health or stamina, do more damage with certain weapon types, start with particular items in your inventory, etc. The list was pretty impressive, and it was fun to experiment with new builds. I personally loved running the then popular Golden Arm Thrower build that was focused on spears and javelins as my primary weapons. The second big game changer was the inclusion of airdrops, and by extension, funk. You see, when you began the match, your primary goal beyond killing people is to obtain the tools to do so. This meant either scavenging buildings for various random weapons, crafting your own, or using your airdrop. In order to call in your airdrop, you needed a certain amount of funk, the game's currency. You could obtain this by exploring, killing your enemies, or recycling items at various machines around the map. So while you could jump in with some general perks and grab or craft whichever items you happen to find to murder your enemies with, you could also be super picky and recycle your items to gain very specific ones if you so desired as well. There's a lot more to the game's mechanics, such as man-tracking devices, adrenaline boosts and armor shots, health stations that cost funk to use and loudly announce your location to anyone nearby, and much more. But the point to this in-depth summary of the game's mechanics is to better convey how this game's potential was snuffed out the way that it was. To me, I found these mechanics brilliant and super entertaining, especially with it being so early to the Battle Royale market. As the first few months in the game's infancy progressed, the game was starting to shape up pretty well with bug fixes, balance patches, and new content and servers. Players didn't always agree with the decisions made, but seemed generally pretty happy with the communications between the player base and the developers. The reality was that with every new balance patch, the game became more and more unbalanced, particularly in the realm of melee combat, which was one of the biggest draws of the game. Xavient began this process of fiddling with mechanics which should have been near permanent and not very malleable, and every new patch brought more and more changes to these core mechanics. Players began the process of vacating the Culling, claiming that the developers were crippling the game harder with every patch, which is the worst way to garner success for a new game. Everyone who was super pumped about how the game initially played and were spreading the word about what was so great about it were now reeling back and retracting their glowing endorsements. At this point in the game's life cycle, most fans and critics tended to agree that redacting most of the game's changes and making the game the way it used to be, while still keeping in the bug fixes and the good changes, was probably the best course of action for the game's health. Unfortunately, Xavient was seemingly too proud to simply revert their changes, and instead started to try to cater to streamers who had the highest view counts, tweaking the game based off of their individual input. Having dug themselves into a deeper corner, Xavient's pandering towards their seemingly last lifeline went so far as employees advocating the brigading of individual players which the streamer was disgruntled with. While this trend wasn't exclusive to the Culling, the game simply didn't have the same support and player count which H1Z1 had to dampen the fallout associated with treating streamers like kings. It was a slippery slope in which Xavient pushed further and further down the road of alienating their fanbase to a staggering degree. This odd behavior from the developer only continued onward as they seemed desperate to stem the bleeding, going so far as carving away half of the game's perks and gameplay customization in the hopes that less RNG would be the remedy to bring the player base back up. This idea was expanded on even further when Xavient replaced their more exciting airdrops with very vanilla and basic ones, a decision which made the game easier to balance, but more boring to play. It's actually almost comical at this point in the script, as I'm looking at these changes like, we removed block stagger, and my hands are gravitating towards my own eyes in an effort to salvage my suspension of disbelief. Because it really doesn't take a AAA game developer with 25 years of experience to see that alienating your dedicated, albeit small, player base in the most asinine way possible is what most would call not a good move. At any rate, I could continue going through every decision which was made in this process, but it all boils down to the game becoming a shell of its former self. As Xavient looked bitterly on at the success of H1Z1, and then PUBG, and then later on Fortnite, the jaded developers continued to vacuum out the components that made the Culling a unique video game, one that set itself apart from the traditional formula of the Battle Royale experience. By the end of the game's dwindling life cycle, a typical match of the Culling would follow a formula in which everyone used the same perks, airdrops, and techniques. If you chose to try to sit along the edge of the map and not fight, you were punished by players who gained killstreak perks, which gave them the advantage over those who had chose to stick to the shadows. This meant that even your playstyle was squashed to a point of conformity if you wanted the best chance at winning. The culmination of all of Xavient's poor decisions came in the form of what could only be described as a power play in the shape of the Culling 2. At this point in the Culling's bizarre adventure, the first game was considered out of early access, and there was no more communication from Xavient to anyone, despite public outcry from the hardcore defenders, fanboys, and veterans of the game. And then, suddenly, a light in the darkness. Like a surprise birthday party for someone who had died 2 years ago, Xavient unveiled their hidden project, the Culling 2, and slapped a casual release date of next goddamn week onto it. And what did players get when the newest game dropped? In a fever dream of poor decisions, Xavient's icing on the cake was to pull the corpse of their former fanbase's hopes and dreams onto the center stage and just American history X them into the curb. The blatant, unpolished PUBG clone was more than just dead on arrival, it was dead on conception, and yet Xavient rolled it out like it was their golden goose, as if to say, Huh? Check this shit out. Probably feeling pretty silly after doubting us, huh? Needless to say, the next major decision Xavient made was pulling the game from Steam.
I think most of you know that last week we launched the Culling 2, and that launch was not successful.
After that, the fragmented remains of the Culling's community rejoiced as the Culling Origins was announced as a free-to-play game. In a staggering example of the third time's the charm mentality, Xavient decided as a company that maybe they might have not been correct about this entire situation. The company announced that their original game was being released as free-to-play, and with every major patch which tweaked the game to a state of boring and stale gameplay, completely reverted back to its original scope. It's almost admirable in a way, watching the company struggle ever onward to get that taste of success that they initially experienced. It's hard to not sound pretentious about this whole thing, but it's much harder to dismiss and overlook the abhorrent decisions made by Xavient throughout this entire endeavor. It really comes down to choosing between wanting to see a company pay for its transgressions and wanting to see a genuinely fun game like The Culling succeed in the market. Although, I guess you could argue that their comeuppance arrived in the form of The Culling 2's dramatic failure. So just where does The Culling stand after this circus of development hell? Well, as of the reopening of their servers in the form of the Culling Origins, the game's population has increased by 4,300% from August to September of this year, which puts it right around what its average population was in September of 2016. While that doesn't sound very promising, it is a pretty big step in the right direction. Maybe it's possible that Xavient made it through this Groundhog Day development haze with a new knowledge and perspective. Or maybe the Culling will implode one last time before fizzling into the wind. Thanks for watching. This video was a bit of a personal project for me to vent my frustrations about a game concept which I really enjoyed at the beginning, but had to witness its failure in an agonizing way. The rest of my channel runs the gamut of whatever's on my mind at any given time, so feel free to check out my other videos if that vague and unclear description made you crave more for some reason. Also, in an unprecedented move that hasn't been seen before, I stream on Twitch. I know, it's a bold move and I may even be the first person to do it, but check that out if you want to see me bumble through whatever game I'm playing at the time. Have a good one.